Tonight on Nation to Nation, we're coming to you from British Columbia with a special edition. We focus on Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project. Yes, the chief of the Yale First Nation accepted a deal, but he felt he had no choice. The chief of the Lower Nicola First Nation has a conditional deal. If the pipeline goes through, he doesn't want his community left behind.
Regardless of what happens, whether it goes ahead or not, we don't want to be left behind.
And we speak to the lawyer who drafted Section 35 of the Constitution. He says Indigenous people hold the legal gavel on pipeline negotiations.
They're kind of an overarching kind of right that's a higher level of right than the debate between Canada and the provinces.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran, and welcome to Nation to Nation. Behind me are some of the tanks that Kinder Morgan fills with bitumen destined for a foreign market. And its expansion plans will be the focus of the next half hour. Starting with Chief Ken Hansen. He's the first to admit his community faced dire financial straits, a bad treaty deal, and being on the brink of third-party management had impoverished the Yale First Nation. Widespread poor housing on reserve was the most visible result. So when Kinder Morgan's negotiators showed up waving $100 bills, Chief Hansen felt he had to sign on the dotted line, despite his concerns about the deal. Joining me now is Chief Hansen. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Welcome, thank you.
Now, why did you sign on to this deal?
The deal with Kinder Morgan. What I did, I came into leadership about 3.5 years ago, and my membership was already full into consultation with the previous leadership, Chief and Council. There's been several meetings explaining where the pipeline's going, the route of the pipeline, and quite frankly, it's a financial deal. The membership voted on it, they wanted it. When I came into leadership, there was very on the brink of third-party management. We have a signed and ratified BC treaty, and it drove us into third-party management. So our membership was dependent on huge cash payouts from the BC treaty process. And they saw this Kinder Morgan deal as an opportunity for money, direct money into their pockets.
So other than direct money into their pockets, will it do anything else for the community?
What it did, I was in a financial place where I had to accept this money. A local plumber wouldn't take us on to do local plumbing work because of our reputation. The past administration, the past leadership have so damaged our credibility. We couldn't afford housing, couldn't afford food, couldn't afford essential services for our membership. So with this amount of money we accepted, we are able to put houses on the ground. I guess the biggest factor of it would be we're able to hire qualified people in our office, people who are not band members. I really wanted to keep the conflict of interest without it arising.
Do you think if there hadn't been if your community didn't need the money so much, do you think they still would have gone for this deal?
I think our community has become dependent on our band office for cash handouts. It's a learned behavior created from the past. Now when the word Kinder Morgan is spoken, my phone lights up and they're asking how much money are we getting. They expect a cash payout when they hear the word Kinder Morgan.
I suppose that, I don't know, how do you feel about that, that it's this way?
Myself, it's sad. I do not like the dependency of our people on a band office. I believe handing out money isn't the smartest financial decision, but I do understand where they're coming from and the way they were treated in the past, and it's a learned behavior.
Now, of course, one of your neighbors, Coldwater, is doing a judicial review on this. You could kill the whole project. What would happen to your community and yourself if that did happen?
If the project was...
if it was cancelled outright?
If the project was cancelled outright, I don't think it would hurt us at all. I think with our deal, we put a timeline on it. If no oil flows in a certain amount of time in the pipeline, our deal's void.
And if it does happen, do you get any extra benefits?
When oil flows, we will get a little financial contribution, but it's minute.
How satisfied were you that the duty to consult was done properly in your case?
In my case, I don't think the duty to consult was satisfied. I think it was put forward to us and essentially a cash deal hung in front of us. We were in a financial state where we needed the money. Our community was in despair, and the money helped us come out of that situation.
Do you feel then that Kinder Morgan maybe took advantage of that situation?
I can't comment on that, whether they took advantage of it or not, but it certainly was our case. We needed the money because of the various reasons, and it went to our community in form of trained professionals to help us come out of our financial debt.
So what do you think of the fierce opposition, of course, down on the coast, just downriver from us, all those arrests and whatnot?
The opposition, I understand it. When we signed this deal, I felt a lot of shame. My name is on this deal. When I came into leadership, the membership wanted this. I didn't want to sign it. If the pipeline is going to go through and the financial contribution helps us, and it's a good thing. I'm about the people. Our people needed the help, and this is one way of getting it. The opposition down in the valley, down in the mainland, is their opposition. But I do understand where they're coming from. When I agreed to sign an MBA, it was agreed on the small portion of the pipeline in the ground where there's already an existing one. And our community felt that that risk was low.
How do you feel about getting your community, I suppose, out of third-party management without having to sign this deal? Because it seems like you're pretty ambivalent about having to sign this. What would you rather have done to get your community to a healthy place?
What I'd rather have done was some form of different arrangement. I was literally had my hands tied. I was handed a failed treaty, one of the worst agreements, I think, across Canada for a BC treaty. Drove us right down into financial despair, and I had no other option at that time. We had houses, we had people living in RV trailers without running septic tanks. We had no water. Some were third-party, third world country conditions here in Canada.
And where do you think you are at this point?
Right now, as far as what?
As what you described to me, third world country conditions.
Right now, Yale is forging on some of the most initiative housing projects in Canada. We're the greenest reserve per capita in Canada right now. We have net zero passive housing designs. We have clean water now. We have the ability to chlorinate to keep people safe. We have food in stomachs. Our community is going through processes where they can start rebuilding that community. They actually have a voice now.
But it sounds at the end of the day, you hoped you could do all this and wouldn't have had to kind of sign a deal with the devil, is what it sounds like to me.
Deal with the devil? I'm not too sure if they're the devil, but the community spoke. It wasn't I'm one person, one vote. The community spoke and they wanted me to sign this. As their elected leader, I took it.
Okay, well, Chief Hansen, I want to thank you again for taking some time and talking to me. Thank you.
Thank you.
After the break, we speak to the chief of another First Nation that accepted a deal. Welcome back to Nation to Nation. Over a year ago, the Lower Nicola Indian Band narrowly voted to accept a conditional agreement with Kinder Morgan, as only 187 of 964 eligible voters cast a ballot. Chief Aaron Sumexheltza expressed disappointment with the low turnout, but committed himself and his council to work out what's next for his community. For example, payments have already been earmarked to upgrade the band's fire hall in a First Nation about 2.5-hour drive north of Vancouver. And joining me now is Chief Aaron Sumexheltza. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Hi, thank you for having me today.
Now, off the bat, I want to ask you, what do you think of how this whole Kinder Morgan thing is unfolded? You know, we've got province versus province. We actually have First Nation versus First Nation. How do you characterize how it's unfolded?
Well, I believe that, for the benefit of the country, it's important that we have a dialogue that is more, maybe not so adversarial, but, and not so much positioning, but looking at the different interests of the different parties and being able to identify those interests and try to move forward in a way that is respectful and collaborative and moving away for the benefit of everybody involved.
How exactly can you do that when it seems like these two sides are so entrenched? We've got those protesters down at Camp Cloud near the tank farm. You've got politicians being arrested. How can we overcome that?
Well, it comes to leadership, really. I mean, it's really easy, from my perspective, on social media and our politicians to position themselves on one side of the argument or the other. With our Prime Minister, for example, there's the environmental concerns, there's the concerns here in British Columbia, but there's also the economic interests in Alberta, and I think it's imperative on our leadership to look at ways to come to solutions and a place where we don't have one side or the other, but yeah, we come to a place where everybody benefits. I also think on the Indigenous side, in terms of Indigenous leaders, there's also there's a variety of opinions, obviously, but I do think that it is important that Indigenous people are heard, but it's also important that we look at ways that we can move forward together.
Do you think Indigenous people haven't heard enough? Of course, there was criticisms when that big summit was held between the Prime Minister and the Premiers of BC and Alberta. There was no Indigenous voice at that. Was that a mistake, or how do you see that?
I think it is difficult because there's so many varying opinions. There's over 100 bands between Alberta and Vancouver Island. So yeah, it's tough to be able to have Indigenous people at the table, but for us to move forward in a collective way, it's imperative that the Indigenous voice be heard.
Okay, so let's talk about your community and what you've been negotiating. I know that certainly along the pipeline route there used to be 51 deals, now it's 43. And your deal is a conditional one. What do you mean when you say conditional?
So when we signed a conditional agreement, what we decided to do was we weren't done negotiating with Kinder Morgan. So after we signed, we've continued to have dialogue with the company, and we continue to do so now. And we did have a referendum in our community, but some point down the road, sooner than later, I would say within the next 30 to 60 days, our Chief and Council is going to look at the agreement we have and look at the different sections of the agreement and then make a decision to sign the ratified agreement or not.
Is there anything in specific that the company can offer you that would turn that conditional into yeah, for sure we'll sign this deal?
Well, there's a lot of different factors. There's environmental concerns, there is employment and contracting opportunities. So there's a variety of different opinions. There's myself and there's also our council. So it's about the council as a whole deciding to sign the agreement or not and looking at all the different concerns that we have.
What are some specific things, though, that the community would benefit from if you signed on to this deal?
Well, there's financial benefits specifically as well. There's potential benefits in terms of us having joint venture partners in terms of, for example, right-of-way clearing, security work, and others. A lot of the work is specialized, but we've been working hard over the last many months to secure relationships with potential partners.
Are you worried that if you do sign on and you do get some of those jobs, it's just temporary, and once the pipeline is built, the jobs and the economic opportunities will disappear with it?
Sure. There's the jobs, most of the jobs are temporary, and one of the things that we have to look at is, the environmental concerns. Even though we're from the interior of British Columbia here, one thing that many people don't realize is that we're still, for example, very reliant on salmon right? And they go down to the ocean and then they come back and spawn every 4 or so years. And we're relying on them for our food and our health. So it's about balancing those potential benefits over the short term as well, and with the environmental concerns and relating to food security, etc.
Now, you ran for the NDP unsuccessfully. Do you think those ties to the NDP will affect negotiations in any way?
No, I would say not. I'm not. I am the elected chief of the Lower Nicola Indian Band, and the Lower Nicola Band members are my constituents. We had a referendum because I felt, and my council felt, it was important for us not to impose our personal opinions or perspectives on the membership. So we had a referendum. We didn't say that you should vote in favor or against it. We provided information to our community members, and then they're the ones that voted.
Of course, you do now have an NDP premier, is propped up by 3 members of the Green Party, of course. Do you feel he's handled this whole situation, especially he's going to take the whole issue to court, ask for a judicial review, and this may not meet Kinder Morgan's May 31st deadline?
Well, I do believe that the Premier is doing everything he can from his perspective to support British Columbians. He campaigned on his concerns specific to the protecting our coast, and I think he's still doing that. So I believe that he was elected, and I don't think his position has really changed.
Would you prefer that the deal could come through, so that the pipeline could come through and you could get those benefits?
Well, it's really not up to me. What's important to me is regardless of what happens, whether it goes ahead or not, we don't want to be left behind, right? At the same time, of course, I'm concerned about, like I said, our salmon, climate change, these kind of issues. So I believe that the Premier should show leadership. I believe the Prime Minister should show leadership so we can get to that place where, everybody's voices are heard.
Chief Sumexheltza, I want to again thank you for being on Nation to Nation.
Well, thank you for having me.
Another break, and we speak to a lawyer who drafted Section 35 of the Constitution. He says First Nations hold the hammer in pipeline negotiations. In 1981, Jack Woodward was a young 20-something lawyer, and he was tasked with drafting Section 35 of the Constitution. It recognizes and affirms existing and treaty rights of Aboriginal people. Since then, Woodward has been a leading authority on Indigenous law. And when it comes to the Kinder Morgan project, he says if government and industry ignore Indigenous rights, they do so at their peril. So joining me now is Jack Woodward. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Hi, Todd. Good to be here.
Now, how important are Indigenous rights in this whole Kinder Morgan story?
Thanks for asking, Todd. It's the whole untold story of it. Everybody's heard about the debate between Trudeau and Notley on the one hand, and John Horgan, the Premier of British Columbia, on the other. That's about the federal-provincial issue. That's a constitutional issue that they have to resolve, and they will resolve. But the sleeper behind this is the First Nations rights. There's several different categories of First Nations rights that could affect, even stop this pipeline. Even, interestingly, some Indian Act issues, but mainly we're talking about Section 35 rights.
Can you give me an example of what could stop this pipeline dead then,
okay,
as far as Indigenous rights goes?
Absolutely. Well, I'll start with the simple ones. Where the pipes cross reserve lands, there's a fiduciary obligation on the part of the federal crown not to mess up those reserves. In some cases, there's drinking water issues. Can you believe it? In this day and age, there's drinking water issues that might be affected by that pipeline, and that's what the Coldwater First Nation is dealing with, a pipe that crosses their aquifer. If there's a spill of the substance that's going to be in that pipeline, which is diluted bitumen, it's very toxic, very poisonous, and it would destroy their aquifer. That would be their drinking water. So they've got a legitimate concern. That's just on the reserve side. Then you've got the Aboriginal rights side. You've got 3 kinds: treaty rights, Aboriginal rights, and Aboriginal title, and all 3 are at play with respect to the proposed Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion.
Why do you think none of this has been played out, especially in the mainstream media, enough?
Well, I think it's for two reasons. First of all, of course, the federal and provincial governments have big publicity machines, and they're making a big political noise about it, and it's easily understood by the mainstream media, the debate between a province and the federal government, or between two provinces. The media likes that kind of a fight. And then on the other side, the First Nations, you're dealing with not one united First Nation, but multiple different First Nations, each with their own issues. And each of their issues are sometimes more complicated to explain. And because they're complicated, the media doesn't pay as much attention.
Now, I just read a news report that senior bureaucrats may have been lobbied to push the Kinder Morgan pipeline at the same time they're consulting with First Nations. What's the danger in all that?
Well, first of all, it's a huge legal danger. The legal danger is that the consultation, the whole process of consultation, gets thrown out the window as being founded on wrong facts, and so you can't negotiate in good faith and be concealing a hidden agenda. That's well established in the case law. So that recent news report, nice expose, I would say, by the National Observer, it makes it seem, if the facts are true, it makes it seem as though the consultation was not done in good faith with a hidden agenda.
The major players have all been talking about this is all unconstitutional, this is a constitutional crisis, talking about the premiers of Alberta and BC and the federal government, of course. But you think they've got it all wrong. What do you mean by that?
Well, let me give an example from freedom of the press. You're a journalist, so if somebody came along to you and said, you can't report that story because we don't like what you say, you'd defend yourself to say that under freedom of the press. And it wouldn't matter whether that was Canada or a province that said that, because you'd go to the Charter of Rights, and the Charter of Rights would strike down that law, whether it was federal or provincial. And Aboriginal rights are the same. They're kind of an overarching kind of right that's a higher level of right than the debate between Canada and the provinces. So right now, all the attention is between the debate between Canada and the provinces, or between Canada and one province, Alberta, and the other province, British Columbia. But it doesn't really matter what either of them do. It doesn't really matter who wins that fight. If the pipeline interferes with Aboriginal rights under Section 35, they are at the same standard as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They're a higher level of constitutional law, and they will be effective to stop the pipeline.
It doesn't sound like this is being taken into consideration, especially when this May 31st deadline came out from Kinder Morgan. How can you possibly meet that deadline if this Indigenous rights is over top of everything here?
Well, the lawyers I've talked to laugh at that May 31st deadline. It's not a realistic deadline in terms of resolving the process. It sounds to me like an excuse for Kinder Morgan to walk away from the project, because they can't seriously believe that Canada will have resolved all of the administrative and legal issues by May 31st. We know for a fact that the court issues will not be resolved by then. So it can't be a genuine deadline. It must be posturing.
Okay, Mr. Woodward, I want to thank you again for doing this. Thank you for being on Nation to Nation.
Oh, it's an honor, as always. Thank you so much, Todd.
That's our show from the West Coast. Next week, we're back in Ottawa. We'll be coming to you from the Assembly of First Nations Special Chiefs meeting on federal legislation. And if you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out the Nation to Nation podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamoran. Have a great day.